Thank you for visiting Nancy's Classic Bedtime Stories. I'm Nancy, and we're continuing in William F. Buckley Jr.'s Let Us Talk of Many Things, the collected speeches, and we begin. Who did get us into this mess? The opening statement in a debate with Murray Kempton on the topic, Who got us into this mess? The University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, April 16th, 1963. Murray Kempton was a poet-journalist, and it was he who suggested the topic for this debate. The first paragraph of my opening statement is a nice example of topical badinage. The key, number 1, Professor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and I debate in Boston. Number 2, in high sarcasm, he tells the student audience, Mr. Buckley has a facility for rhetoric, which I envy, as well as a wit, which I seek clumsily and vainly to emulate. Number 3, a collection of my work is published in the fall, and I print as a blurb these words from Schlesinger, as if they were solemnly intended. Number 4, he hires the massive firm of Greenbaum, Wolfe, and Ernst to sue me and the publisher unless I agree to remove the tribute intended as caricature. Number 5, I decline to do so, and the tribute lives on in all editions of the book, rumbles left and right. Kempton and I were close friends, and he dedicated his last book to me. It is a pleasure to meet with Murray Kempton. He has a facility for rhetoric which I envy, as well as a wit which I seek clumsily and vainly to emulate. He can quote me, I shall not sue. Mr. Kempton would probably construe my decision not to sue him as an antisocial refusal to redistribute my wealth among misers. Greenbaum, Wolfe, and Ernst, for Mr. Kempton, is nothing if not complicated. Indeed, his views are so complicated that sometimes, as you may have observed, they are sound. That can get him into trouble. On one occasion, we appeared together on a television program. By concerted effort, we managed to interrupt Mr. David Susskind just long enough to make our simple points, which happened to converge. On what subject, I am not absolutely sure now. Whether it was our common admiration for William Butler Yeats or for Westbrook Pegler. There was, in any case, a quite general dismay, upon which Mr. Susskind, reaching for a word adequate to express his consternation, remarked that what he had just heard was gallimaufry. Do you know that Mr. Murray Kempton has a mean streak? Because he thereupon said, right to Mr. Susskind's face and before the billion-odd people who were listening, what does gallimaufry mean, Mr. Susskind? Now, Kempton knew exactly what the word meant. He knows what all the words mean and how to use them, even if he doesn't know for what purposes to use them, which is the root cause of his Johnsonian melancholy. But for an instant, Mr. Suskind's face was frozen in horror. And who should come gallantly to his rescue? The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the Peace Corps. No, a conservative, yours truly, whose job it is, some of you may have noticed, to mediate the harsh effects of liberal behavior whenever it manifests itself. Where was I? Oh, yeah, that was a rhetorical question. I know exactly where I was. I was saying that I have the honor of sharing some of Mr. Kempton's opinions, and that he runs the risk of sharing some of mine. And I go on to say that there is nothing, I hope, that the polarizing tug of our public quarrels will do to cause him to relinquish certain of his opinions merely in order to disagree with me, and vice versa. Well, who did get us into this mess? The contest appears to be close in intellectual circles between the reactionaries who hold Adam and Eve responsible and the progressives who blame the John Birch Society. The only thing the liberals appear absolutely certain of is that they did not get us into this mess. But then, of course, we need to ask the prior question. How do you define a mess? Albert J. Nock once thought it would be amusing to write an essay on how to go about discovering that you are living in a dark age. But that is the kind of question that invites the still prior question. How do you define anything? And that, of course, is the point at which liberals and conservatives frequently separate, the former using the terminology of the academy, tending up towards epistemological pessimism, the latter towards epistemological optimism. What is a mess? Not Jackson Pollock, not Kandinsky, not William Burroughs. That, after all, as Malraux has told us, is how our painters paint and our writers write. And by what other standards can we judge them? The pitch of human life that surely is a mess. Or is it? Is it really so that the materialist criterion governs? How many of you arrived here hungry tonight? Or how are we to assume that what messes exist do so outside of the University of Pennsylvania? Malcolm Muggeridge says that culture is those few moments when we, who are essentially pigs, lift our heads from the trough and look about. Really? By that standard, Marx, whose mouth was seldom at the trough, but whose mind never left it, was a cultured man. Was he a mess? Who dreamed of a mess making on a cosmic scale? Can we agree that Castro's Cuba is a mess? Oh, no, we can't. Richard Rovere of The New Yorker, whose role as chief messologist for the establishment has led him for years to identify as messes any ambiguous phenomena that emerge on the starboard horizon, and to see absolutely nothing at all over on the port side, not even if it is a hurricane, if there is a hurricane blazing in it. Richard Rovere reported recently that in fact it is a considerable blessing that Castro occupies the island of Cuba. The things are much better for us and for anti-communism in Latin America on account of the closeness of a communist-dominated state that they were when the nearest communist state was 4,000 abstract miles away. By an extension of that thinking, we'd be better off still if we say Ohio went communist. The law of the left appears to be, if there is a mess, the right created it. The right does not blame everything on the left, believing as we do that all human beings are to be dangerous degree mess inclined, and that any plans for us made by human beings with super duper ideas had better take this fact into consideration, as also this other fact, that their idea of what is super duper may not appeal to me at all, and that I count ex officio as a human being. So that paradoxically, the conservatives see man, because of his penchant for mess making, as the conclusive argument against utopian social craftsmanship. And we see the very same man, because of innate worth, as the principal argument against victimization by grandiose social manipulations. It makes no difference that in a democracy, a man visits these schemes upon himself. They are no less noxious for their popularity. It is all we can hope for that a few people in any age can truly be thought of as housebroken, in English, non-mess makers. The majority of us, Plato's many, Jefferson's herd, Ortega's masses, are properly the object of the best and most urgent concern of the spiritual and intellectual aristocrats. But these last must not, at the risk of losing their station, invite us, by sycophantic advances upon the majority, to prescribe false standards, depose reality and crowned surreality, and debauch the moral patrimony. We must all cooperate in the maintenance of standards. The messes, to return to the original question, cannot be located, let alone removed. If we cannot distinguish, to begin with, between a daffodil and a dung heap, and our failure to perceive the difference, if somebody said you've got to live in America or live in Russia for the rest of your days, asked the interrogator of C.P. Snow, which would you choose? Well, answered Sir Charles, that is very difficult. I think, to be honest, I could be happy in either of them. Our failure to perceive the difference is the best index of the mess we are in. Let me suggest who got us into this mess by a drastically simplified account of a few of those things that this conservative, at any rate, cares deeply about, so that we can then ask, how are we faring? I care deeply about religion. There are obvious shortcomings in the exasperated disjunction of Charles Piguet, but I quote his statement not to emphasize its transparent failings, but to acknowledge its suggestive vitality. He said, "There is as much difference between a Christian and a pagan as there is between a pagan and a dog." Now, thereby, Piguet's standards, probably fewer Christians in America than there are entries in the social register, and any correspondence between the two is purely coincidental. But our age strains to cut the cord altogether. In our public philosophy, it was 80 years ago that Nietzsche announced the death of God, but the celebrations continue riotous to this day. In our educational institutions, witness the long knifemanship in the academic world directed against the believer. In our jurisprudence, the First Amendment, conjoined with our system of public education, has become an instrument of secularism. And even in our theology, early this month, the Bishop of Woolwich vouchsafed to his flock the news that they need not, in order to be Christians, believe in any kind of God. I care for the freedom of the individual. We live in a straitened world, and so must accept dutifully the impositions of technology, the demands of order in an increasingly interdependent society, the necessity for continence in those situations where individual agitations can lead to decisions that affect not merely the agitators, but many others. Yet I say that the question that precedes any consideration of any piece of legislation ought still to be, will this measure augment or diminish the individual's freedom? And up against this criterion, most of our coercive legislative measures would fail, as would clearly, in English, the immunities conferred upon our monopoly labor unions, as would the farm subsidies and the protective tariffs, as would such measures as in recent days have authorized the federal government to collect taxes to pay 60% of the cost of a bridge vaulting the richest business district in America, in Hartford, Connecticut, and to study the problem of juvenile delinquency in New York City. And yet I care not merely that men should be left free to make their own decisions, but also that we should have every opportunity to learn to make them wisely and to cultivate the desire to make them wisely. And so I care deeply about the corruption of words and ideals, by which, for instance, we deceive ourselves into believing that freedom consists in closed shops, in coercive social security, in FTCs and ICCs, FPCs and NLRBs. I care about the efforts of those ideologues who feed and then live off the economic illiteracy of the people by promulgating the myth of the spontaneously generating dollar in Washington, D.C., whose programs call for every man's shouldering of others' concerns, but never his own, who are always shooting down the U-2 planes we conservatives seek stealthily to launch, which might from great heights observe and relay to the people the crazy traffic in crisscrossing dollars that is blackening the skies. I care about the strategic imbecility, I use the phrase of Adolf Berle, and the moral imbecility, I use the phrase of Peter Viereck, of those who failed to recognize the nature of the communist thrust, and who therefore proved incompetent to contain it before it had ravaged what is sometimes spoken of casually as 1 billion or so people, which I ask that we think of not in the macrocosmic terms that are fashionable among the mess makers, the only food their IBM machines will tolerate, but in individual terms, you, me, him, her, and say it again until you count to 1 billion. I care about the loss of the intellectual and moral apparatus by which purposive communication is possible. Murray Kempton is a good man, better, I am sure, than those who oppose him, certainly including myself. But for all his knowledge and for all his wit, he does not know, appears not to be capable of knowing, what is the nature, let alone the dimensions, of the threat. so that he can continue to worry more about the House Committee on Un-American Activities than about the Soviet Union, to consider himself a partisan of freedom while enrolling as a member of the Socialist Party, to pitch for the common man while celebrating the outrages of monopoly labor unions, to address a gathering of communists as brothers, as though he were Francis of Assisi, which he comes close to being, come to think of it, but not close enough to call communists his brothers under Klieg lights. St. Francis could hardly have talked to the birds while serving as an editor of the New Republic. I say to the would-be mess removers, fear the Lord and love him, and laugh gently in the faces of those who disdain him. Resist kindly, but no less firmly, the ministrations of those who would reach into your very shower to adjust the temperature of the water according to their most recent afflatus. Reinstruct men in the maxim of William Osler that their freedom ends where the freedom of others begins. Study the ways of the enemy and learn to outwit him. And read Murray Kempton, but don't relax. And, in moments of despair, read Murray Kempton, who at least will usher you sweetly into the dark age and numb your great pain. The end.